He walked in with a faded coat and a cloth bag in hand. The receptionist didn't even ask his name, just pointed him to the exit. Laughter followed when he said, "This bank used to be mine." But when he opened that old bag, everything, history, power, and silence, shifted. So what happens when the man everyone ignored turns out to be the one they all work for? Before we dive into this powerful true story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Your support helps us bring you more stories that challenge what we think we know. Let's get started. The morning light through the tall glass doors spilled onto the polished marble floor. Inside Bridgemont Trust Bank, everything moved with quiet efficiency, clicks of keyboards, the soft shuffle of forms, and greetings laced with habit, not warmth. He arrived without fanfare, no car service, no polished shoes, just a pair of worn-out leather soles and a bag that looked older than some of the employees inside. No one noticed him at first. Not the teller counting 20s. Not the couple whispering about mortgage rates. Only Monica at the front desk glanced up, just long enough to decide he didn't belong. He didn't smile, didn't flinch, just waited. His hands rested gently on the top of his cane. His eyes drifted toward the plaques on the wall. What no one in the lobby knew was that he had once stood at the heart of this building, not as a client, not as a visitor, but as its founder. And today, he came back, not for revenge, not for money, but to ask one simple question. Does the truth still matter here? Monday mornings at Bridgemont Trust Bank in Rockview were predictable, almost sterile. The hum of printers, the clipped heels across marble tiles, and the low murmur of small-town transactions filled the air. Nothing ever really changed here, at least not since anyone could remember. Elijah C.K. Kirby pushed through the revolving glass doors like a man walking into memory. His coat, more thread than fabric now, hung from narrow shoulders that once carried more than most could bear. His shoes, worn and creased, tapped lightly against the polished floor as he stepped inside, clutching a faded cloth bag against his chest with both hands. No one noticed him at first. Not the young teller double-checking a deposit, nor the elderly woman arguing softly with her husband about a wire transfer. But Monica Sloan, perched behind the reception desk with her neatly pressed blazer and a name tag that gleamed under the lights, lifted her gaze. She narrowed her eyes, barely hiding the distaste in her voice. "Can I help you, sir?" she asked, her tone mechanical, as if offering a menu rather than assistance. Elijah looked at her with eyes that had seen more decades than she had holidays. He didn't smile, he didn't blink, he simply said, "This bank belongs to me." Monica paused for a split second, then laughed. It was the kind of laugh people give when they're embarrassed for someone else. Heads turned. A young man at the ATM snorted. Even the security guard at the door, Stephen Miller, square-jawed and freshly shaved, chuckled under his breath as he moved toward Elijah. "Sir," Stephen said, placing his hand near his belt. "Let's not make a scene." Elijah didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice or offer an explanation. He just looked around the lobby like a man revisiting an old photograph. His gaze moved from the ceiling beams to the long walnut counter, to the bronze plaques along the wall. There was something in his face, an ache, maybe, or the weight of something no one else could see. Monica crossed her arms, tapping a pen against the counter. "You think you own the place?" she said, half amused, half annoyed. "Is that it?" "I don't think," Elijah replied. "I remember." The lobby grew quieter than anyone realized. Even Stephen hesitated. There was something unsettling about Elijah's certainty, like a man quoting scripture in a courtroom. That's when James Temp stepped out from his office, drawn by the shift in tone. His navy blue suit was crisp, and his walk carried the authority of someone who didn't like surprises. He sized up Elijah in 2 seconds, old, frail, clearly mistaken, and turned to Monica. "What's the problem here?" "This gentleman believes the bank belongs to him," Monica said, voice still laced with irony. James looked at Elijah directly, politely but firmly. "Sir, do you need help with something today?" Elijah didn't move. He simply placed the cloth bag onto the counter with care, like it held more than paper, more than money. "I'm not here for help," he said. "I'm here because I used to sit on the other side of that glass." He nodded toward James's office, his voice even, as if he'd just stated the weather. Something in James's posture shifted, almost imperceptibly. A pause, a flicker of curiosity that passed behind his eyes. Before anyone could speak again, Elijah rested both hands on the bag and added, quietly, I just want to see if anyone in this building still knows what truth looks like. And with that, the room, for the first time in years, forgot how to breathe. James Temp approached with the calm posture of a man used to being in control. He gave Monica a brief nod, then looked to the old man seated in the middle of the lobby. Elijah sat with a stillness that made him seem more permanent than the furniture. His cloth bag resting on his lap like something sacred. James kept his voice steady. Sir, I'm James Temp, the branch manager. If there's something we can assist you with today, I'll be happy to help. Otherwise, I'd kindly ask that you let our team get back to serving other clients. Before Elijah could respond, Monica spoke again, this time louder, trying to reclaim the attention of the lobby. He believes he owns the bank, she said, smirking as she turned toward a nearby teller, who chuckled quietly in response. James gave Monica a glance, meant to quiet, not scold, but she missed it entirely. Elijah didn't move. He sat silently, his eyes following the edges of the room like a man rereading a story he never finished. I'd rather not make a scene, James continued, but I have to ask you, sir, are you here to make a transaction? There was a long pause before Elijah finally replied, not with an answer, but with a question. Do you know who signed the original charter for this bank? The room didn't react right away. It was the kind of question no one expects to be asked in a bank. On a Monday morning, by someone with threadbare sleeves and clouded eyes. Monica scoffed and turned away. Oh, come on. But James didn't laugh. He didn't even smile. His brow furrowed slightly, just enough to show something had tugged at the edge of his curiosity. Stephen, the security guard, moved closer. His steps were slow, measured. Sir, he said quietly, leaning in just enough to let the pressure in his voice carry. This bank doesn't serve fantasies. I'm going to have to ask you to leave before this gets complicated. Elijah didn't flinch. Instead, he reached forward and placed the cloth bag on the counter with the kind of care reserved for things too precious to explain. He didn't open it. He didn't need to. The very act of putting it there changed the energy in the room. Conversations faded. Footsteps slowed. The rustling of paperwork ceased. James took a half step forward, his eyes flicking down to the bag, then back to Elijah. Something had shifted, subtle, but undeniable. I'm not here to waste anyone's time, Elijah said, but I've waited long enough. 60 years. To be exact. James tilted his head slightly. 60 years for what? Elijah's hands remained on the bag, fingers curled around the fabric as though bracing against memory. To come back to the place I helped build, and to see if my name still means anything within these walls. That sentence landed like dust settling on an unopened book. The kind people had forgotten was there. Someone from the line, an older woman in a floral scarf, turned her head. A young man in a suit stepped aside, suddenly unsure whether to stay or leave. Even Monica stopped mid-sentence. Elijah finally began to untie the string around the bag. His movements were slow but sure, revealing the spine of an old, worn ledger, its leather cracked, its corners rounded with time. James stared at it, and for a man who had spent his career controlling meetings, diffusing conflict, and balancing power with charm, this moment left him quiet. Elijah didn't look at the crowd. He looked straight at James and said, without a trace of bitterness, just wait. Like an old truth long denied. You're sitting in the same office where I once signed the first loan papers. Right over there, 60 years ago. And for the first time that morning, James Temp had no words. James Temp stood with the old ledger open in his hands, its pages yellowed and fragile beneath his fingers. He wasn't reading anymore, he was staring. Near the center, scrawled in ink that had faded but not disappeared, sat the name that had started this quiet storm. E.C. Kirby, co-founder. He read it once, then twice, as if repetition might prove it was a mistake. But the letters didn't change. There was no ambiguity. The signature was clear, written in the kind of cursive that spoke of a different era, neat, purposeful, proud. Behind him, Monica craned her neck to peek over his shoulder. Still holding on to a disbelieving smirk, Stephen Miller shifted uneasily by the counter, arms crossed, but his usual confidence felt thinner than before. The room hadn't gone silent. Not quite, but it had become strangely aware of itself. Like a church after the last hymn. Elijah remained seated, his hands resting calmly on the now open bag. Without a word, he reached inside again and pulled out a small stack of documents. Yellowed at the edges, bound loosely with twine, he untied them with care and spread them on the counter one by one. First, an original partnership agreement from 1948, bearing both his name and John Williams's. Then a set of hand-drawn branch layouts, complete with notes in Elijah's handwriting. And finally, a single-page transfer document, unsigned, untouched. The page where his name should have been written in surrender was blank. James stared at that page longer than the others. He turned it over, looking for hidden notations. There were none. "I never signed it," Elijah said softly, "because I never agreed to step away. But they didn't need my permission. Not back then. All they needed was time. And silence. They had plenty of both." James looked up. "You're saying this was taken from you?" "I'm saying," Elijah replied, "they wrote me out without ever using a pen." His voice didn't shake. It didn't accuse. It simply carried the quiet weight of someone who had lived too long with a truth too heavy to speak. "The day I walked out of this building," Elijah continued, "John looked me in the eye and said the company had changed direction. That it was better for business if my name wasn't on the walls anymore. And just like that, the story got rewritten. You know how it works." James did know. He didn't need Elijah to explain further. He had seen it before, not always so blatantly, not always so cruelly, but the pattern was familiar. Control didn't always come with signatures. Sometimes it came with silence, with the absence of paperwork, with files that were never filed. James motioned toward the back office. "Let me check something." He stepped away, the ledger still in hand, and made a call to the records department. He requested all scanned documents from 1948 to 1951, particularly any pertaining to ownership transfers or board restructuring. While they waited, Monica leaned in toward Elijah with a faint sneer. "Even if this were real, what's your point? It's not like you're getting anything back." Elijah didn't respond. He just looked at her, eyes steady, and said, "It's not always about what you get back. Sometimes, it's about what you no longer let them keep." Monica's expression faltered for the first time, but she said nothing. Minutes passed before James returned, a printed file folder in hand. His face was pale, his jaw set. He laid the documents on the counter and turned them slowly. There were indeed records from those years, board notes, internal memos, but not a single transfer document bore Elijah's signature. The only ones filed were amendments, void of any legal proof of release from the co-founder. He looked at Elijah, and in a voice stripped of polish, said, "There's no record of you ever giving up your stake." "Not one." Elijah gave a small nod, not of triumph, but of confirmation, as though he had rehearsed hearing those words in his mind for decades. "Just never out loud. I'm not here to sue anyone," he said. "I'm not here for revenge. I just want to know if, this time, someone's willing to see what's always been there." James didn't answer right away. His eyes moved between the ledger and the unsigned page. He swallowed once, then looked directly at Elijah, not as a man seeing a ghost, but as someone realizing they'd been living inside a lie. "You're not joking," James said, barely above a whisper. And for a moment, no one laughed. The lobby, just moments before filled with quiet amusement and routine motion, had become a space where time slowed. The air felt heavier now, thick with something unspoken. James Temp stood near the counter, his phone pressed to his ear as he waited for the legal department to pick up. His fingers tapped against the glass surface, not out of impatience but out of a strange discomfort he couldn't quite name yet. Across from him, Elijah sat with a patience that seemed unnatural in the setting. He hadn't said another word since laying out the documents. His hands rested gently on the knob of his wooden cane, and his eyes stared into the far end of the bank. Though they weren't really focused there, it was as if he was seeing something that the rest of them had long forgotten, or never cared to look at in the first place. The receptionist, Monica, who had just minutes ago been so smug, stood behind her desk now with her arms drawn tighter across her chest. She avoided eye contact, her mouth pressed into a line that betrayed unease. Her confidence, once firm, now hung in the air like perfume too strong for the room. Then a voice, soft but sure, broke through the silence. "I remember that name," the older woman said, stepping out from the line. Her hair was gray and pinned neatly, and she wore a sweater the color of faded brick. "Kirby, Elijah C. Kirby. He donated to the Grace Methodist Church back in '52. My husband was on the board back then." All heads turned. Even James paused, the phone momentarily forgotten in his hand. The woman stepped closer, peering down at the ledger with tired but attentive eyes. "You gave the money to fix the bell tower," she said, nodding slowly. "They never put your name on the plaque. I always thought that was strange." Elijah offered her the faintest smile, a tilt of the mouth that didn't need words. He neither confirmed nor denied, but the warmth in his expression seemed to land heavier than any speech could have. James finally spoke into the phone, giving his name and requesting that the documents Elijah brought be reviewed for authenticity. His voice was lower now, and less certain. When he hung up, he looked at the older woman. "Mrs. Bennett," he said, "you were treasurer of the township for several years, weren't you?" 32, she said, "and retired just before the Matthews family took over the board here." That was when the bank stopped putting up portraits. The mention of the Matthews name created a subtle shift. A few people exchanged glances. It wasn't uncommon knowledge in Rockview that the Matthews family had their hands in most institutions, quietly, efficiently, and without question. Stephen, the security guard, began to feel the stirrings of discomfort. He looked at James, then at Elijah, then at the small but growing circle of quiet witnesses gathering around. This wasn't a case of removing a disruptive visitor anymore. This was something else, something far less defined, and far more dangerous to mishandle. "What do you want me to do?" Stephen asked quietly, leaning toward James. James didn't answer right away. He ran a hand through his hair, looking not at Stephen but at the ledger still open before him. It stared back with a kind of defiance that paper rarely carried. "I think," James said, almost to himself, "we're standing in the middle of something none of us were supposed to see." A soft chime sounded from his phone. He picked it up, unlocked the screen, and read the message from the records department. No formal transfer, no signed release, no document legally removing Elijah C.K. Kirby from the founding board. The final note attached was even shorter. No signature, no surrender. James read the words twice, then slowly placed the phone on the counter. He looked at Elijah, then at the others. Monica's face had lost all its color. Stephen stood perfectly still. No one spoke. And yet, something was undeniably speaking now, louder than words, louder than laughter. Something long buried was rising. Not with anger, not yet, but with a kind of moral gravity that pulled everything into question. And James, for the first time in his career, wasn't sure if he wanted to be the man who had all the answers. The tension in the room had begun to hum, a quiet, invisible frequency that buzzed beneath every breath. You could see it in the way people stopped pretending not to watch. In the way even the bank's air conditioning seemed to go silent. Everything held its breath. Stephen Miller took a step closer to Elijah, his polished black shoes clicking sharply against the marble floor. His eyes, once glazed with routine authority, now glinted with something more brittle, something that flickered between control and panic. "That's enough," he said, louder than necessary. "You've made your point, sir, but this isn't a museum. And you're not a guest of honor. You're disrupting business." He placed a hand near his belt, close to the holstered firearm he carried like a badge of final say. His voice dropped, hardening. "If you don't leave now, I'll have to escort you out." Elijah didn't move, not his shoulders, not his hands, not even the angle of his chin. He sat as if time had already decided whose side it was on. His gaze was steady, not confrontational, but rooted deep in something older than defiance. "I already left once," he said, voice low and clear. "It took me 60 years to walk back through that door. I won't do it again just because someone's uncomfortable." James Temp stepped forward before Stephen could answer. His tone was different now, not managerial, not rehearsed. It carried a weight that came from something real. No one touches him, James said. Stephen blinked, caught off guard by the shift. With all due respect, Mr. Temp, we're here to protect order, not babysit folklore. James didn't raise his voice, but there was no mistaking the sharpness in his words. We're here to protect the truth, he said, even if it makes us uncomfortable. Especially then. Stephen's jaw clenched, his fingers twitched near the edge of his belt. Around them, the crowd had grown. Customers who had come to deposit checks or inquire about mortgages now stood still, uncertain whether they were witnessing history or something more volatile. A woman in a yellow cardigan whispered to her husband. A young man stopped pretending to scroll through his phone. The whole room seemed suspended between two possibilities, order or reckoning. Luis Ortega, a junior associate usually buried in spreadsheets and soft-spoken apologies, stepped away from his desk without a word. He walked over to the copier, picked up the documents Elijah had laid out, and began to scan them, one by one. The soft whir of the machine was the only sound in the room, but it felt louder than any shout. Stephen noticed. His hand moved again. James saw it. If you draw that weapon, James said slowly, stepping between Stephen and Elijah, you won't be aiming at him. You'll be aiming at everything we're supposed to stand for. He held his ground. No suit armor, no scripted lines, just the quiet fire of someone who'd seen the tide shift and finally chose which shore to stand on. Stephen hesitated. There was a moment, brief, tight, where no one knew what would happen next. His fingers curled around the leather of his holster. His breath came short, but something behind his eyes faltered. It wasn't weakness, it was realization, a small, slow awareness that whatever authority he thought he had might not be enough to hold this moment back. James didn't flinch. If you pull that gun, he said, you better be ready to explain why truth scares you more than an old man with a story. And in the hush that followed, the silence didn't just return, it settled, like dust on polished wood, on shoulders that had carried too much for too long. The silence in the bank had taken on a texture. It wasn't the kind of quiet that followed a loud moment, it was the heavy, aware kind. It felt like being in a room where someone had just spoken a truth no one wanted to hear. And now everyone was left with the weight of it. James and Stephen still stood a few feet apart. Stephen's hand had eased away from his weapon, but the tension in his shoulders hadn't left. James, meanwhile, kept his place, his stance no longer managerial but protective, like a man who knew what side he was standing on and wasn't moving. Elijah sat still, his hand resting on the cane's carved handle, eyes not on the men arguing over him, but across the lobby. He watched the employees behind the counters, their postures stiff, their expressions unreadable. He was looking for something, not confrontation, not praise, recognition. Then it happened. Emily Carter, the youngest teller on the floor, stepped quietly out from behind her counter. She was no taller than 5'4". Her ponytail pulled back a little too tight, as if she didn't yet trust the world enough to let herself soften. She had barely spoken all morning, but now her eyes were fixed on the small piece of paper that had slipped from Elijah's bag and landed near her feet. It was an old $10 bill, faded, worn, but still legible. Printed across the top was a long retired logo of Bridgemont Trust Bank. Underneath it, in faint ink, was the name, E.C. Kirby. Not typed, printed, custom. She picked it up. The room didn't shift immediately. It waited. Emily walked across the floor toward the counter where Elijah sat. She didn't look at Monica or Stephen or even James. She walked like someone carrying something fragile. And when she reached the counter, she gently placed the bill on top of the documents. Then, in a voice neither loud nor unsure, she said, I believe you. Her words weren't dramatic, but they broke something. Luis Ortega, the shy young man from the records desk, stepped forward next. He didn't say anything. He simply carried the freshly scanned documents, copies of Elijah's ledger, the unsigned transfer, the old partnership agreements, and laid them beside the $10 bill. He gave Elijah a small nod before stepping back. Then Martha Nguyen, senior accountant for nearly a decade, stepped out from behind her desk. She was the kind of woman who rarely spoke unless it was necessary, who valued facts more than feelings. But her voice, when it came, carried a weight that no memo ever could. I've seen names go missing from systems before, She said, I've seen records get lost. What happened to you? It's not unfamiliar. Another silence fell, but this one was different. Customers, once distracted or skeptical, were now whispering. An elderly man leaned over to his wife. I think I remember hearing something about a Mr. Kirby when I was a boy. He said, my father mentioned him once. Said he helped fund the Veterans Fund after the war. A woman near the exit paused at the sound of Elijah's name. Didn't he used to sponsor scholarships? I thought that was a myth. They weren't whispers of doubt anymore. They were echoes, fragments of a memory that had been dusted off. Slowly reconnecting. Back near the counter, one more thing happened. Emily, now standing to Elijah's left, reached up and unclipped her name tag from her blouse. She stared at it for a moment, then placed it gently on the counter in front of him. Luis did the same. Then Martha. One by one, each employee stepped forward, even those who had said nothing. Those who had only watched, now moved. They unclipped their name tags and laid them beside the ledger, the $10 bill, and the stack of papers. No words, just gesture. Monica, still behind the desk, watched it unfold. Her fingers trembled slightly as she touched the edge of her own name tag. She didn't move, not yet. Elijah said nothing. He simply looked at the growing line of badges. The silent row of names once worn with pride now offered like apologies. It wasn't a protest. It wasn't rebellion. It was something older than both, something close to redemption. By the time Tina Caldwell stepped through the front doors of Bridgemont Trust Bank, the buzz had already spread beyond the brick walls. Her editor had sent her the message with a touch of sarcasm. Old man claims to own the bank. Go see if he's wearing a cape or just forgot his meds. But as soon as she entered and saw the ledger, the scanned documents, and the staff quietly clustered around the counter without a word of protest, she didn't reach for her camera. She reached for her notebook. Tina had covered a lot of things in this town: ribbon cuttings, school board squabbles, small town scandals that never quite made it past the county line. But she knew a story when she felt it in her bones. This wasn't a photo op. This was a reckoning. Elijah remained seated, still as stone, the cloth bag now nearly empty beside him. James Temp stood nearby, no longer just a manager of operations, but something closer to a witness, or maybe a reluctant participant in a trial that didn't require a courtroom. Within the hour, James had scheduled a meeting with the bank's governing board, men and women who rarely gathered in one place unless money was at stake. He requested the conference room. They gave him the upstairs boardroom. Arthur Matthews arrived last, of course. He swept into the room like a man used to being looked at. His tailored charcoal suit, his expensive cologne, his gold cufflinks, everything about him was curated. He gave James a practiced smile that didn't reach his eyes. So, Arthur said as he took his seat at the head of the table, we're entertaining fairy tales now. James didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took a breath and began laying out copies of the documents on the long, lacquered table, one by one. The ledger, the unsigned transfer form, the notarized partnership agreement, the official statement from the bank's legal department confirming no legitimate transfer of shares had ever been recorded. The handwriting analysis confirming that the documents were authentic. Arthur glanced at them briefly, then folded his hands. Paper ages, he said with a dismissive tone. Stories stretch, memory blurs. None of this changes the present. James looked at him, not with anger, but with something cooler, measured. It doesn't change the present, James said, but it forces us to confront how we got here. Arthur chuckled dryly. You're suggesting we rewrite the bank's history over one man's delusion? No, James replied. I'm suggesting we correct it. Other board members shifted in their seats. A few avoided eye contact. One woman, older, with silver hair pulled tight at the nape of her neck, cleared her throat softly, but Arthur leaned back, confident. And if we don't? James met his gaze without blinking. I'll go public, with everything. The records, the statements, the names. The media is already downstairs. And they're not here for a ribbon cutting. You'll lose your job, Arthur said with a quiet edge. I'm aware. Arthur leaned forward now, the charm fading from his voice. You think some dusty name is worth burning down your career? James let that sit in the air before answering. There are chairs not worth sitting in. even if they're wrapped in the finest leather. The room fell quiet, not tense, just still, like the pause before a storm. By the time James left the boardroom, Tina Caldwell was waiting near the lobby, notebook still in hand. She had already spoken to 2 staffers off record and was piecing the narrative together in real time. Outside, the late afternoon light cast long shadows across the marble floor. Elijah stood near the entrance now, upright but unmoving. There was something dignified in the way he carried himself, like a man not trying to prove anything, only waiting to be seen clearly. At last, Tina approached, microphone in hand. "Mr. Kirby," she said, gentle but direct, "if the board confirms your role as the founder, what do you plan to do next?" Elijah looked past her for a moment, not lost, just reflective. Then he turned to her, his voice quiet but firm. "I'll go home," he said, "and for the first time, I'll hang my nameplate back on the wall. Not because I need anyone to see it, just because I don't want to keep hiding it from myself." And then, with a nod, he walked through the front doors, not away from the truth, but through it. The lobby of Bridgemont Trust Bank was unusually quiet for a weekday morning. No long lines, no irritated glances at ticking clocks, just a gentle hush, the kind that settles when something unspoken has finally been put into words. Mounted on the stone wall above the main reception desk, just beneath the gleaming brass logo of the bank, was a new plaque. It wasn't oversized, it didn't flash, it simply read, "Elijah C.K. Kirby, co-founder, 1948. There had been no ribbon cutting, no press conference, no one had made a speech, just a carpenter, an unmarked box, and a silent agreement among those who had watched the truth arrive in quiet, determined pieces. A single wooden chair had been placed below the plaque. Nothing ceremonial, just a chair, aged, polished, and worn at the arms, like the man who now sat in it. Elijah didn't move much. He rested both hands on his cane and gazed up at the name carved into metal. His own name, finally given the space it had been denied for 6 decades. It wasn't pride on his face, not satisfaction, just stillness. James Temp had turned in his keys 3 days before. No press, no fuss. His resignation letter had been brief. Just a single sheet left on the boardroom table. Silence prolonged becomes complicity. No one had argued. Emily and Luis came in early that day, their new name tags clipped neatly onto their shirts. They had designed them themselves. Underneath their names, a small line of print read, "Inheritor of Truth." The idea had been Martha's. No one said much when they handed the stack around, but everyone accepted one. Even Monica, whose expression that morning was quieter than usual, had her new badge pinned in straight. Elijah had returned just once. He walked through the doors carrying the same cloth bag, now thinner, softer with age. Inside, he carried only 2 things: a small photograph of him and John Williams standing in front of the first Bridgemont Trust office, and a pocket-sized journal with notes in faded ink. He didn't need a meeting. He didn't ask to speak with anyone. He just sat beneath the plaque for a while, his fingers lightly tracing the edges of the photo, his thoughts wandering somewhere between then and now. He didn't touch the journal. As he stood to leave, he turned once and pressed his hand gently against the brass. Not for long, just enough to feel it, to let it feel him. No camera clicked, no headline burst across screens. But when he pushed open the glass door, the morning sun spilled across his shoulders like a quiet acknowledgement. Outside, the street moved on. Cars passed. A child dropped a schoolbook. A bus rolled by with its windows half open. Elijah didn't look back. He didn't need to. The next day, the local paper ran a single-column article on page 2. No bold font, no scandal. The headline read, "History corrected not by force, but by patience." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't ask for pity. He just placed his hand on a name that never should have been forgotten. And somehow, that said more than any speech ever could. Because the loudest truths aren't always shouted. They're the ones we finally dare to say out loud. After a lifetime of silence, not all legacies are written in stone. Some are whispered back into the light. If this story stirred something in you, a memory, a question, or even just a pause, subscribe to Undercover Truths for more stories that echo long after they end. Thank you for watching.